Good evening. Welcome to Oblong Online this evening. Thank you for joining us. My name's Helen Soslowski and I'm the events director for Oblong Books. Before I introduce our guests this evening, if you have questions for either guest, you can enter them in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a chat box at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Or there's also a place that says ask a question at the very bottom of your screen, and you can enter your questions in there and we will address them at the end of the program. For those of you who'd like to purchase a signed copy of Valcour, there's a buy the book button at the bottom of your screen underneath where you see the authors. For those of you who prefer to listen to your books, you can also buy Valcour as an audio book that is narrated by David Colaci, and that's available for purchase through Libro FM, through Oblong Books, and the link for that is in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. So let's get to it. We couldn't be more excited this evening to be launching Jack Kelly's new book, Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty, which recounts the wild and suspenseful story of one of the most crucial and least known naval campaigns of the Revolutionary War, led by none other than the notorious Benedict Arnold. Jack Kelly is an award-winning author and historian. His books include Band of Giants, The Amateur Soldiers Who Won America's Independence, which received the DAR History Medal, The Edge of Anarchy, Heaven's Ditch, and Gunpowder. He has also published 5 novels and is a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow in Nonfiction Literature. Kelly has also appeared on the History Channel, National Public Radio, and C-SPAN. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen.
Conducting the conversation with Jack this evening is senior editor at Politico, Terry Golway. Terry is the author of Frank and Al, FDR, Al Smith, and the Unlikely Alliance That Created the Modern Democratic Party, Irish Rebel, John Devoy and America's Fight for Ireland's Freedom, and Machine Made, Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics. He's been a columnist and city editor at the New York Observer, a member of the editorial board of the New York Times, and a columnist for the Irish Echo. Welcome, Jack and Terry, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for tuning in tonight. It's an honor to be speaking with Jack because he's written a terrific book, and I can't recommend it enough. I've done a little, well, compared to Jack, I've done very little research into the American Revolution myself, and I have to say, this was a battle I had never heard of. I mean, when we think of the American Revolution in New York State, certain things come to mind for those of us who aren't as educated as Jack. West Point, of course, right? And you know, the big one, the Battle of Saratoga, the Battle of New York City, which George Washington lost. But the events that he relates, a sea battle basically in Lake Champlain, is something I had never heard of. And I wonder, Jack, just to get started, if you could tell me, how did you find out about this battle? And more specifically, what led you to see this very important theme that you illustrate so well, which is that this was a really critical moment in the fight for American independence, and you, dear reader, need to know more about it.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. I wrote an earlier book called Band of Giants, which was sort of an overview of the Revolutionary War, and I came across this battle and this campaign, really, because the campaign went on all summer and culminated in a very wild battle on Lake Champlain. And I refer to it as the most important unknown battle of the Revolutionary War. And I always cite a book by David McCullough, who I consider a really top-notch historian, one of our great historians, great storyteller. He wrote a book called 1776, which was an account of the war during the year 1776. And there's not a single mention of this entire campaign in his book. Everything that he focused on was, as you said, George Washington, the debacle in New York, really, that ended up with Washington having to retreat all the way down across New Jersey and cross the Delaware into Pennsylvania. But the British had decided really during the spring of '76 to put down the rebellion in America by attacking two ends of a corridor that ran from Quebec City down the St. Lawrence River. There's the Richelieu River that runs down to Lake Champlain, down through that chain of lakes, Lake Champlain and Lake George, down the Hudson River to New York. That was the main access to the interior, and it was a very convenient way of invading the colonies from Canada. They also sent an army to New York, so they were attacking both ends of this waterway, this major corridor, which was also a way that they could have attacked into New England from essentially the back door. So if you got into Lake Champlain, you could turn over and start heading towards New Hampshire. If you got onto the Hudson River, you could attack eastward into Massachusetts and Connecticut. At both ends, Americans had to put up a fight. The fight on Lake Champlain was really centered around Fort Ticonderoga, which is a good ways south on Lake Champlain, and at Crown Point, which is two forts, a nearby fort that the Americans had taken from the British the year before. It happened that the campaign in the north was successful. They actually, by building a fleet on Lake Champlain and fighting a battle up there, they delayed the British and they held them off until it got to be too late in the season for the British to continue south on Lake Champlain, and they basically went back to Canada. Whereas at the other end of the corridor, as I mentioned, George Washington really got beaten very badly. So the really two campaigns are bookends to one of the most serious aspects of the war, and why I know a few of the reasons why the northern campaign was neglected, but that it was neglected is certainly a fact.
Well, I have to ask, what are the factors that you think has led to this neglect? Because as you describe it so well in this book, yes, you describe the battle, on the lake so well, but you describe the strategy and what was at stake in 1776 in northern New York in a way that I've never seen it before. And I wonder, what are the rest of us missing that you've captured?
Well, I think the reason that the northern campaign has been ignored and the southern campaign, though, was much less successful, has been emphasized. There's really two or three reasons. The first one is that the army that was fighting in the north, the army that started the campaign at Fort Ticonderoga, had the previous year invaded Canada. And the invasion of Canada is an aspect of the revolution that generally tends to be ignored as well. It was sort of embarrassing that the freedom-loving patriots, their first impulse was to go up and invade a neighboring province. Plus, that campaign was a total disaster, and that army was almost demolished in Canada and came straggling back to Fort Ticonderoga, where they'd started out. That was one thing. It says the connection to the invasion of Canada. The second thing is that the campaign around New York, it's kind of like one of the Rocky movies. We get to see George Washington pounded and forced to retreat and defeated, and he's on the ropes, and then suddenly he makes this big comeback and crosses the Delaware River and attacks Trenton and saves the day. It's a very triumphant story, and it's a good story. So I think David McCullough was looking for a good story. And the third reason, which I think is perhaps the most important reason, is that Benedict Arnold was the leader and the hero of the campaign in the North, and it's nobody wants to give Benedict Arnold any credit. It's much easier to sing the praises of George Washington, but I think that to get a real feel for the scope of the war and how the war played out, we have to pay attention to Benedict Arnold and give him credit.
Well, right. I mean, some people might point out or remember that Benedict Arnold was a hero at the Battle of Saratoga as well. And that part of the campaign, of course, is much better known. You know, the Battle of Saratoga is taught regularly, and I think correctly, as an important milestone because it was after Horatio Gates defeated the British Army there that France decided to enter the war and all those other things. But you've touched on Benedict Arnold, and you're right. I mean, he is indeed the central character, certainly the Central American character in your book, and he comes across in your book as, well, a bit of a maniac, but a courageous one. And you know, without him, fair to say that all was lost here.
Yeah, I think that I like to focus on characters. I think that to tell a good story about history, you really have to focus on the characters. And it turned out that there were 3 commanders in the North during the campaign, all of them quite interesting. Philip Schuyler, who you rarely hear about as a Revolutionary War general, he's actually more famous today as the father of Alexander Hamilton's wife. And it was featured in, the Schuyler sisters were featured in the musical Hamilton. But he was not a great battle leader, but he had been a businessman, and he was a great man with logistics. He knew how to get the supplies up and get the boats built that they needed on Lake Champlain. The man on the spot was Horatio Gates. He was commanding at Fort Ticonderoga, and he had the experience from his experience in the British Army of knowing how to restore the army to morale and to a sort of a fighting trim, this broken army that had come back from Canada. And then Benedict Arnold, though he had almost no military experience before the war started, had been a sea captain. So he had the expertise and the knowledge of sailing and boats to direct the building of the fleet, the small fleet that they were able to build, and then was pretty much the admiral of that fleet during the battle. I'd have to say Benedict Arnold had a natural intuition about war. He was really a genius of war. He just had a feel for strategy and tactics that it had nothing to do with training. It was just he was a very aggressive person. He was a great, really inspired leader of men, and he outthought the British and planned and took the initiative and was able to stand up to the Royal Navy, which had a much larger and much more powerful fleet.
You know, one of the things that I was struck by too, anytime I find myself in a mystery about a historical episode that's been ignored, often the first question I have is, well, maybe there's a dearth of sources. What about in your own research? Did you find any obstacles in that regard, or was the research there waiting for you?
No, the documents and records that relate to the campaign, though they aren't overly extensive, are pretty thorough, and they've been published. And there's a massive multi-volume set of documents that was published called the Naval Documents of the Revolutionary War. It runs to about 14 volumes, I think, and in there were anything that related to naval affairs was in there. And there were a few of the soldiers and people that were involved in the battle. They kept diaries. One 14-year-old boy actually was brought along by his uncle, and he kept a short diary of what happened, so we can sort of see from his perspective. So it wasn't hidden. And when I say it's unknown, it's not unknown to scholars of the Revolutionary War, but it's the general public. It's generally really an aspect of the war that just doesn't come across.
What do you think the British learned from this affair? Because clearly they would have, based on what I've read here, I mean, they certainly would have expected to be able to overrun this ragtag navy that this amateur had put together. And if you could also explain, what their, I mean, you sort of touched upon it, but if you could just explain what their thinking was as they came south from Canada to take on these ruffians from the colonies.
Yeah, that's a good point. The British had material advantage. They had much bigger ships, bigger guns. They had well-trained Royal Navy sailors sailing the ships. They had trained gunners. Most of the men on the American gunboats had been farmers before the war. They didn't know how to even sail a boat, so they had to learn as they were going along. But I think it somewhat shows how important initiative and really just strategic smarts are in warfare. In spite of all the advantages of the British, Benedict Arnold was able to plot a strategy which he really, in the main battle at Valcour Island, had the British at a disadvantage because he was in a little harbor between Valcour Island, which is barely a mile off the New York coast, and there's a bay that separates the two, and he had his battle line in there, and he induced the British to come at him from the south after they sailed past the island, and the wind was from the north, or rather brisk wind from the north. So most of the major British ships were not able to engage the Americans during the battle. Most of the battle was carried on by gunboats firing back and forth.
One of the other things that I was reminded of in reading the book is, we sometimes have this image of our founders as, icons and liberty lovers, but they were rivals too. And you certainly touch upon Horatio Gates and his rivalry with George Washington. And there was also some discomfort, I would say, if I remember correctly, between Schuyler and some of his associates. So how much, well, here's a better question. How much of these commanders that you write about, the characters you write about, were driven by a need for fame as opposed to a desire to win liberty?
Well, that is a complicated question, I guess we'd have to say. But I think every one of them, the commanders at that point. Now, General Schuyler was probably the most suspect in terms of, he was a very wealthy man from Albany, had been a businessman, was not in favor of independence. So he was suspect in what his motivation was, and he was questioned at the time. Some people thought he was a British agent, that he was in there trying to sway the events for the British. But that wasn't true, and he really did commit himself and put his fortune at risk by siding with the Patriots. General Gates had an overblown view of his own abilities. He always, spent most of the war plotting as how he was going to replace Washington as head of the Continental Army, and it never came off, but it certainly hampered him. He was not a good enough general to have replaced Washington, but he was also very, very much dedicated to the cause. And the same thing with Benedict Arnold. He started out, in the war, he paid troops with his own money. He lost much of his fortune. He was a fairly wealthy man too, and was dedicated to the cause. As the war went on, of course, as you know, that's almost 8 years of warfare. People changed, and Benedict Arnold was sort of the person that changed the most over the war, of gathering resentment, and never thought he got the promotions that he deserved, and ended up in 1780, which is 4 years after this battle, going over to the British and actually fighting for the British. So it was,
because one of the things that I was struck by in my own book about Nathaniel Greenes, who was a major general and went down south in 1780 and won several. Of course, down south, by the way, they will tell you that their part of the war is the least known part of the American Revolution as well.
And I would agree with that to a certain extent, yes.
Right. But in reading Greenes' letters, and they've been published in 14 volumes, I was taken by how nakedly ambitious Greenes was. I mean, he like you pointed out about Schuyler and all of them, they truly were sacrificing their lives and their sacred honor for sure. But Greenes was positioning himself for a post-war life of leadership, and sort of made no bones about it. And I suppose when we try to examine the lives of these founders, and I haven't seen the play Hamilton, so I don't know how much this is part of it, but these were ambitious people.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And George Washington himself, his great rectitude as a noble figure was part of an act. And I think John Adams said that George Washington was the greatest actor of his age. But his act was that he was going to be a very noble figure, not so much because he wanted power, because he refused the power that he could have grabbed after the war, but just his position in history. And he went through all his orders that he issued during the Revolutionary War and had them rewritten so they would be neat and tidy once the record was examined as what he'd done during the war. The record of the war, a lot of it was in the written orders that had gone back and forth. So he was certainly aware of his position in history, I think you'd have to say they all were.
Sure. Now, I see a question which anticipated one of my questions, which is, how did we get a naval battle on Lake Champlain? I mean, it's not on a seaport, right? How did all these ships happen? And of course, you have the answer, which is that they were built for the most part right there, right?
Yeah, the Americans started out with a couple of sailing boats, really just schooners. They're about 50-foot long schooners with guns on them that they'd captured from the British. And they began building in the campaign really began in July at both ends. The Americans were down at the very southern tip of Lake Champlain, building these gunboats, and then building some slightly larger boats that they called schooners, or that they called galleys or row galleys. And those were all built at the southern end of Lake Champlain. At the northern end, up on the Richelieu River, the British were building their boats. Many of them had been under construction or had been sent over from England as kits, essentially. And they were just hammered together. And the General Carleton, who was the commander of the British, was criticized for spending too much time. And he spent an extra month to take apart a ship that had been under construction at Quebec City, shipping it down to their base down at the north end of Lake Champlain and putting it back together. That was a month that was really wasted because they really didn't need that ship. But he was very cautious, and he just figured he would go when he was ready. So, but that arms race was a big part of the campaign during the months of July and August and into September.
You talk about how these ships were built at some length and with terrific skill. Where did you get that knowledge from?
Well, that was in the papers of Schuyler and General Gates, and there aren't really any collection of papers of Benedict Arnold, but there were some documents that he left behind complaining about this and that, and General Gates wrote many letters to Schuyler to try to get the supplies that he needed, and Schuyler would say, well, why aren't the ships finished? And he said, well, where are the anchors for them? Where is the rope? Everything had to be shipped up in what was really wilderness. Once you got north of Albany, and particularly north of Saratoga, it was just scattered settlements. There was very few roads in the middle of nowhere. So that was the origin of the two fleets. I'd say the British fleet was about twice as big as the American fleet.
And could you also explain where Fort Ticonderoga fits into the strategy? Because I would think that many of the people who are listening may not know about Valcour Island, but they certainly know about, well, I'd like to think they know about Fort Ticonderoga. Yeah,
the Americans had taken Fort Ticonderoga away from the British in 1775. They actually grabbed it before the garrison there heard about Lexington and Concord. The news was very slow getting over to Fort Ticonderoga, so they were able to grab it without firing a shot. And they set up their main defensive position there, but General Gates was concerned that they could hold it. He just didn't think the army was strong enough to hold it if the British came down on top of them. And I think he had a very good point there, because this army had been retreated 200 miles from when they were up in Canada. They had an epidemic of smallpox that he had to deal with, and they just weren't top-notch fighting force. But he tried all summer to get them entrenched at Ticonderoga and be ready to meet the British if they did come down. And it turned out the British never actually came down to Ticonderoga. They after fighting Benedict Arnold on Lake Champlain, they basically decided it was too late in the season and went back to Canada.
What about the ordinary soldiers? What you do tell a few stories, and of course, one of the problems that we historians have about telling history from the ground up is that most people, don't keep diaries. They don't write letters, and in academic history, anyway, there's this movement away from what's called the great man narrative. I could talk about that forever because I oppose that idea. I think it's simplistic, because the fact of the matter is you're able to reconstruct history through written documents, sometimes through oral histories that are passed down. But, the fact of the matter remains, will you tell the story through the eyes of Benedict Arnold, some of the British, Horatio Gates, because those are the materials you have on hand. However, you also do manage to capture what it was like to be a Marine or a sailor on those ships, particularly in the battle scenes, Jack, which are as well written as any battle scenes I've ever read about the American Revolution. So maybe you could describe for us what it was like to be in the heat of battle on Lake Champlain.
The one way I describe it is once the British had lined up their gunboats, they had 22 gunboats. Americans had 8 gunboats and 3 of these galleys I was talking about. A few hundred yards apart, there began a cannon duel. And if you can imagine two men in those days, there was a lot of dueling. And so 2 men would pace off 20 paces and they'd fire pistols at each other. This was a similar type of affair, except they were using very heavy cannon and firing back and forth, 12-pounder cannon. Some of them British had 24-pounder cannon. There's a iron ball, weighed 24 pounds, flying at supersonic speed. And you had to stand there and take it. There was no hiding. There was no taking cover. There was no running away. It was just hope that it didn't hit you. And those cannonballs would go through several inches of oak plank. And when they did that, they sprayed splinters, which could also be lethal. So it was pretty much hell on earth. It was very, very noisy. The sound of cannon is hard to appreciate unless you've seen some demonstrations of cannon fire, but they're extremely loud. And there was hundreds of them hundreds of shots going on continually for 7 hours during the battle. if a cannonball hit you, it would almost certainly kill you, or at least take off an arm or a leg. One of the balls fired by the Americans passed over a schooner that was the General Carleton was commanding from, and just the force of it going by, it didn't hit anything, but it came so close to his head that it knocked him down. So, you know, it's hard to imagine that kind of lethal type of ordnance being fired at you. They were also, the British had occupied Valcour Island. Once they got there, they were firing muskets from both shores, from the New York shore and from the island. And it was very chaotic, very stressful, to say the least, for the Americans. And there were several dozen Americans were killed during the battle.
Well, what was one of the more poignant and horrifying scenes, or facts that you mentioned, when a sailor or somebody aboard the ship went down and was killed, they immediately threw the body overboard because they didn't want blood coming down and causing people to slip all over the deck of the ship, right?
Yeah, it was they used to sprinkle sand on the decks, also for that reason, so they wouldn't get slippery with the blood, and also for the morale. You know, you didn't want to have dead bodies lying around the ship and continue bleeding, so they just threw them overboard. In fact, the captain of one of the British schooner that got involved in the battle was knocked out by a piece of wood that had flown off of one of the American cannonballs hit, and they were about to throw him overboard, and one of his the first mate, I think, said, we better check him to see if he's still alive. And turned out he was still alive, so they sent him down to be bandaged up, but they came very close to this, throwing him overboard.
You know, and I see we have several really good questions, and we're going to get to them soon. But I have one or two others. One is, could you describe for people this fabulous scene towards the end when Benedict Arnold knows that you know, his time has come. He's got to retreat now because the British have him surrounded, and that sort of last act of defiance on Arnold's part, which you write about so well.
Yeah, after the battle that was right at Valcour Island, the Americans were able to escape and head south on Lake Champlain. They were mostly rowing. The wind was against them, and they made it almost down to Crown Point, which was their advanced base. The British caught up with them, and the major British ships were now firing at them. Arnold had 5 boats, and he fought for 2.5 hours against these British fleet, while a few of his other boats were able to get away and get down to Ticonderoga. He then ordered his all the boats into what was called Ferris Bay at that time. It was a tiny little cove that they sailed into, ran the boats aground, set them on fire, and then when the fire reached what was left of their gunpowder, they blew up, so that the British wouldn't be able to take them and use them as, you know, warships of their own. So he never lowered the American flag and kept it flying on all those boats. And then he saved his men's lives by doing that, and they were able to march down south and finally get down to Ticonderoga. And it's interesting to note that that little cove is barely a half mile across, was later renamed Arnold Bay, and that's the only place in the United States now that's named for Benedict Arnold. After his treason, every vestige of him was essentially erased.
How many people who live in upstate New York near Plattsburgh know that that's a fact?
I think it's pretty. It's actually on the Vermont side, so for one thing, and right. But it's so small. It's not. There's nothing there except just a little indentation in the coast. So There's probably as a sign for it, but no commemoration. The Daughters of the American Revolution put up a monument on the New York shore, just opposite Valcour Island, and mentioned Benedict Arnold and mentioned the battle, but that's the only notice you see even around there. You could drive right by it and not know there was one of the most important battles of the war is fought right at that spot.
It is interesting to know, and this will be my last question. I'm going to turn it over to everybody else. But just sort of in summing up the challenge of writing about the American Revolution, as we both, you far more than I, but I have to an extent as well, is that it seems so distant in many ways. I mean, it takes a genius to bring Hamilton. I mean, if you said to somebody 20 years ago that Hamilton would be this success, people would have thought you were crazy. It's hard to sell a book about the American Revolution sometimes because it just seems in our 21st century life to be so distant. But yet, when you examine these events through people, as you do, you recognize these people. You may not recognize the weapons they're fighting with, their way they live, even their culture and values, but there's something about character that is timeless. And I think you do a wonderful job of examining these individuals, these colorful individuals, so that this war suddenly seems much more immediate, and what was at stake becomes more immediate because the people seem familiar to you.
Yeah, I think while I was finishing up the book, of course, was a very troubled time in the country, and there was plenty of questions being raised about, is the revolution still relevant? Are the founders really just a bunch of rich white men? Should we pay any attention to them? And as I'm sure you would agree with, I think as a historian, yes, you have to look at the flaws and the failures of the founding generation. Very, very important. But I think you have to also keep in mind that they put forth an idea, and that was no person is superior because of their birth. And that was a startling idea in those days. It was, in the days of aristocracy and in monarchy, birth was everything. And I particularly, and I'm glad you said what you did, because I'm particularly like to focus on the war and the men and women really who were involved in the war, because they were fighting for that idea, and they were, for the most part, common people. Even many of the officers in the American Army were commoners from a very ordinary backgrounds. So they were willing to go to this northern lake and stand up to those cannon for an idea, and that's I think learning about them and understanding their motivation, understanding what they did, really is to me, it's a little bit of an inspiration that maybe there's still life in that idea, and that the revolution is still, we haven't lived up to it certainly 100%, but the idea is still there, and the idea of liberty, equality, and just basic American ideals.
There's a quote you have towards the end where one of the British officers is sort of paying tribute to Benedict Arnold. And I'm going to butcher the quote, but not the operative phrase, where he says basically, what a shame that General Arnold wasn't fighting for his rightful sovereign. It's which I imagine Benedict Arnold would have said, sovereign this, right?
Well, that brings up an interesting point. Is people talk about Benedict Arnold betrayed his country, but he betrayed his country twice. Yeah. First, he betrayed, turned against the king, and then he turned back and betrayed his adopted country, the new country that he was fighting for. So,
well, and on that topic, let's see if we can deal with a question we have, which is, was Benedict Arnold treated unfairly? Could the story that you tell, could his story have ended differently for him?
I think he was definitely treated unfairly. He after this campaign, and in which he was really heroic. I don't think even people at the time widely recognized his heroism. He expected to be promoted, and when he wasn't promoted, he complained to George Washington, and George Washington just shook his head. He said, "I can't understand it. I don't know why your name isn't on that list of promotions." The promotions always at that time in the country at that time always came from Congress. Arnold didn't have the political sense, I guess you'd say, or the diplomatic maneuvering that was needed to pull the strings in Congress and get the promotions. And he was left very embittered by that. And he still came back. He still fought at Saratoga, but I think the seeds have been planted by the end of this campaign that he was not sure what way he was going to go, but he certainly had a lot of resentment that he kept in his heart for the rest of the war.
And understandably too, because the general I wrote about, Nathaniel Greenes, was promoted to major general after actually a disaster, at Washington Heights, where some failures on his part led to capture of 2,000 Americans on Manhattan Island. But reading his diaries and reading his story, I know that he was a presence in Philadelphia from time to time.
Right. I think it's hard to believe that politics was more involved in the military and then the army affairs then than it is now, but it actually was, and it was. A lot of the promotions, the promotions were distributed by states, so that if you had, each state had to get so many officers in certain ranks, and with no regard to how skillful they were or what was good for the overall army. Washington was continually frustrated by this as well, and there was just nothing that could be done about it. That was the way it was set up.
And we actually have another question about Arnold, saying that so the British fleet was twice the size of the American fleet. The British obviously were a sailing nation, and obviously their troops would have been, they were professional soldiers, right? And they're facing amateurs. So the question is it mainly the genius of Arnold's tactics that held the British off until winter, or were there other significant influencing factors in the standoff?
I think to the extent that Arnold's tactics worked, played a huge role in it. I think the British made enough mistakes of their own that they could have attacked earlier. They could have done other things. They could have kept going once they got down to Crown Point after destroying the American fleet. They essentially lost their nerve. General Carleton, who was the British commander, he was just a little too cautious and a little too quick to decide he'd rather spend the winter back in Quebec than he would down in the besieging Fort Ticonderoga. So I think it was a combination of both things, but certainly I think the British were just shocked at these fanatics. It was really seemed to them like fanaticism, standing up to the Royal Navy in these little boats, and it gave them pause.
Somebody else has asked, could you explain about this concept of too late in the season? How could a sea battle of a day or two impact the schedule that much?
Well, that's a good question, because it was mainly the building of the fleets and the fact that Benedict Arnold went up to the northern part of Lake Champlain in August that kept the British on edge and kept General Carleton, the British commander, thinking he had to keep building his own fleet. So it delayed. Arnold was very surprised that the British didn't come down in 1st of September. But they kept building. They wanted to build this one big frigate. The Carleton was determined to get finished. And so they didn't come down until the 11th of October. And at that point, every day did count, because Carleton was very, very aware of how cold it got in Canada in the winter. and he didn't want the lake to freeze behind him. So there was snow on the ground, it was getting cold, and he wrapped up the season.
And here's a cannon question, as in, where did the United States get their cannon?
The great thing about capturing Fort Ticonderoga was that there was a great supply of cannon there. The best of them were actually transported out to Boston during the winter of 75-76 by Henry Knox to drive the British out of Boston. But there were plenty of others there that they weren't all of the best quality. Some of them, some of the cannon on the American ships went back to the 17th century, were Swedish cannon from 1680, but they were still serviceable, and they had enough of them to. They were more lacking in gunpowder than they were in the actual cannon.
If the outcome had been different, Jack, what would have happened if the British had been able to get down that lake and defeat Arnold decisively on day one, and they were able to make the break? What would have happened, do you think?
Well, it's impossible to say exactly. Both in the campaign of 1776 and 1777, which the British essentially tried to do the same thing again. They talk about splitting the colonies and gaining control of the Hudson River, gaining control of the lakes, and that they would cut off New England. That's not exactly, I don't think that's exactly how it would have worked. If they had gotten down to the end of, taken Fort Ticonderoga, they had quite a few options. There was a road into New Hampshire. They could have marched their army down into New Hampshire, and from there down, coming into Boston from behind. They could have gone into the Mohawk Valley, which was the other direction, and was a very hotly contested area. Or they could have taken Albany and gotten control of the Hudson River. But it certainly was a very, very dangerous situation for the Patriots in both years. And fortunately, they were able to push off the final crux of the matter until they had enough force to gather at Saratoga and defeat the army that came down from Canada.
The other thing that strikes me about reading your book, particularly the scene where you describe the American fleet floating past the British at night as they go south, right? And how astonished the British were when they woke up the next morning and found out they did what? And it sort of reminded me of the close call that George Washington had when he evacuated what is now, I guess, Brooklyn Heights, and escaped to Manhattan Island, sort of at the last minute, the very last possible minute. How many close calls there were in the American Revolution, and how easily, not just at Valcour Island, not just at Saratoga, but certainly down south in several of Nathaniel Greenes' campaigns, one false move one way or the other, and things would have worked out very differently. The American Revolution was a very close run operation.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Terry. And I think that one of the things I usually cite is that in addition to the fact that these captains had learned the lake, they had studied the terrain for a month, and so were familiar with how close to the shore can we get. The British didn't know that. They were seeing it fresh. And the other thing was that these cannon duel are literally deafening. And so many of the men on both sides would have been, you can imagine, just temporarily deaf, or your ears ringing for quite a long time afterwards. So it made it a little bit easier for the Americans to sneak out while the British were repairing their ships and just getting ready for the battle the next day.
Oh, and here's a good question, and you do touch on that: the role of the local Native Americans in the battle on both sides. I guess you could ask.
Yeah, the British had quite a few allies from different tribes in the north, in Canada. And they did come down with the British. They occupied Valcour Island. It was mostly Indians with muskets and I guess some bow and arrows even. They were not a huge factor, except they certainly limited the ability of the Americans this whole month that they were standing around or patrolling up on Lake Champlain. They were afraid to go on land because there were both British patrols and Indians that would and did try to ambush them. The Americans had some Native American allies not directly involved in the battle, but one of General Schuyler's, he was also an Indian commissioner as well as being a general. He spent a month out in the Mohawk Valley trying to make sure that the Iroquois would, who had promised to be neutral, would continue to be neutral. And he thought that was a very important thing because they could have attacked his positions up in Ticonderoga from behind. Mm-hmm. And they did agree to remain neutral for a while. And then ultimately they had to make a decision which side they were going to go on.
Right. And I guess maybe one last question, which is about the difference in the size of the vessels. And did the U.S. vessels, because they were smaller, did that give them an advantage in terms of maneuverability on the lake?
Well, yes, that's a good point. All of the American vessels, except for they had a couple of schooners I mentioned that they'd captured from the British, they were all capable of being rowed. And so fighting on a lake is much different than fighting out in the ocean. So you need maneuverability. You need to be able to go either with the wind or against the wind. And most of the American vessels could be either, if they had the wind with them, they could sail. If they had it against them, they could row. The British gunboats were also like that. They were basically oversized rowboats. But the major British ships, some of which were square rigged, which are very hard to sail toward the wind in a square rigged ship, it turned out to be a disadvantage for them, really. One interesting thing that I usually point out, one of the American gunboats, these were the 53-foot gunboats that sank in Valcour Bay the night after the battle was over, was brought up from the bottom and salvaged in the 1930s. And it found its way into the Smithsonian Institute. And it's on display there today. It's the oldest existing American naval vessel. One of the most poignant relics, I think, of the Revolutionary War, because it's the real thing. This is the actual boat that faced the British. These are the guns that fired at the British. When they brought it up from the bottom, the bow gun was still loaded. So it's a very has a lot of the reality of the war associated with it. And they've actually found another gunboat pretty similar to this one that sank in deep water as they were trying to escape, and that is still sitting at the bottom of Lake Champlain. Mm.
Well, I think we are done with questions, if that is correct. So maybe I'll turn it over to our host.
Thank you both so much, Jack Kelly and Terry Golway. Terry, to your question about Hamilton,
yes.
Having not seen it, I have seen it, and all of the characters were portrayed as, while being idealistic and brave, extremely competitive. Yeah. I mean, they were literally crawling over one another, particularly the ones that weren't born to position.
Right.
There was a lot of kind of scrapping going on in the background to sort of self-aggrandizement, I would say, and fighting for position. So that was a wonderful discussion. Thank you both so much. Congratulations, Jack, on the publication of the book.
Thank you, Helen.
We wish you well with it. We're going to sell a bunch of copies at Oblong. I know that. Get your signed copy, everyone. The little button on the screen. I know many of you have already pre-ordered from us, and thank you for that. Thank you for your support. Thank you also to St. Martin's Press for making this event possible. And thanks to all of you who joined us this evening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening and be well. Thank you all.
Right. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.